Part 4. Master and Disciple. Answers. A group of people who suffered from what is called confined thinking approached a Sufi. They asked him, "Why do you never answer questions in a simple and lucid manner, as we have been trained to do?" He said, "Because my work is to transmit what I have to transmit. Anything I say, and much of what I do, must follow that pattern. If instead I fail in my duty and do instead what you are trying to make me do, I become your instrument, not the instrument of truth." A passerby remarked, "But the last time you were asked that very same question in my presence, your reply was, 'Because I do not want to be like you.'" The Sufi raised his head and said, "If you would only dwell upon the two answers, perhaps you might see that the answers could seem different, whereas in reality they possess the same meaning." Present and absent. It is related of one of the great Sufis of Khorasan that he worked for long hours as a brickmaker, and when people offered him money he refused it. He also used to have long talks with people, encouraging them, and then was not to be seen for long periods, sometimes months on end. This confused the people who tried to learn from him. One day a man whom he had left on his own complained bitterly and asked for an explanation of his conduct, saying, "If I have failed to understand, tell me, so that I may again take up the path." The Sufi said, "I am afraid that I can say nothing to you about all this." This man talked to others, and they added their complaints to his, and gradually they began to lose interest in the Sufi, attaching themselves to all manner of frivolous and more exciting things. Some of them found themselves in the company of a venerable dervish, to whom they confided their disappointment. He said, "O luckless ones, he was working as a brickmaker because to take your money, raw and vulnerable as you were, would have harmed you, and he took on the harm, preferring to labor stooped in the burning sun for 3 pence a day. When he left you on your own, it was sometimes because his attention, through your own weaknesses, would have inflated you and made you worse. At other times he forsook you because he had to make supplications to ask that you should not die before he could help you. At other times he left you alone because people in even greater need than you were to be attended to. You are the kind of people who see all his actions, which are all worthy ones, as faults, because you cannot perceive goodness and reality, and because you think only of the nurturing of the ugliness in your false selves." The people were ashamed, and they said, "Give us permission, O great sage, to return to our master, to make amends to him." He answered, "The permission is easy, and you have it, but the performance is impossible. He is dead, because his earthly life had to stop the moment you deserted him. When he had nobody to attend him, he had to continue on his journey." They said, "Whence did you gain this insight?" The sage said, "I am the solitary remaining disciple of that same master of yours. Only 1 in 1,000 people want to learn. We were, at the outset, 1,000 people. The rest of them are not dead, but they, like you, long ago decided that our late master was insufficient to their needs." The consequence of this addled belief, born of the madness of the world, is that they are all still alive, and now more than proud of themselves is that they are all still alive, and now more than proud of themselves, and all of them are flourishing in the world, and all of them are doomed. Take care. There was once a man who wanted to become the disciple of a certain Sufi sheikh. In fact, he was not prepared to travel the path in the correct order of events, being excitable and greedy. He had, in fact, the characteristics which disable the majority of people from completing the journey. The sheikh, however, gave him a chance, since there was a possibility that he might see, through the consequences of his own flaws in action, that he would have to adopt a completely different approach and become calmer and more considerate. After some time, however, this disciple became quite frustrated with the sheikhs putting him into situations where nothing seemed to happen, and he decided that the teacher was therefore useless. So he cast around for some other teacher, one who would fit in better with his own assumptions about himself. Naturally, he found one. Now, this second teacher was nothing less than a maniac who hated the first one. When he had gained the disciple's confidence and inflamed him with promises of secrets and success, he said, "Now I shall test you. If you pass the test, you will be able to scale the greatest heights of spiritual understanding." The disciple begged to be tested to any extent. "Very well," continued the false teacher, "go and bring me the heart of your first master." The disciple, his head completely turned with the wonderful nature, as he imagined it, of the new teacher, went and killed the sheikh and cut out his heart. Overcome with excitement, full of greed for secrets and mystical attainment, he was running to the false teacher's house with the heart, when he stumbled and nearly fell. And then, as if from the severed heart which he was carrying, came the voice of the murdered sheikh, "Gently, my son, overcome your carelessness and greed." Measurement of loyalty. A certain Sufi teacher was surrounded by disciples, who crowded his house night and day. His repute was such that odes were written in his honor, from Alexandria to Samarkand, and the greatest nobles of the 7 climes asserted that he was the pole star of the age and the greatest teacher of the earth. One day, in conversation with the king of Bokhara, the Sufi said, "Men have no loyalty, even when they think they have. While, for the maintenance of good social relations, one has to compromise with human adulation, there is really no such thing." The king, however, imagined that the Sufi was trying to flatter him by suggesting that people were not really his followers, and he said, "O dervish, vanity, self-seeking, and duplicity are marked in the inwardness of courtiers and others who surround temporal kings like me. But in the case of the sublime kings of the cosmos such as you, such people are not to be found. Only the truly devout follow you, for there is no material inducement for them to do so, therefore their expressed devotion must be real." The dervish said, "In this whole city, and amongst all the people who profess attachment to me, and through me to higher things, there are, to my certain knowledge, only 1 1/2 people who are not fearful or cowardly, if it were to come to a test." In order to test this unlikely theory, the king arranged for the Sufi to be arrested for blasphemy and to be marched through the streets under sentence of death as an example to the people. When the Sufi was arrested, not a single person in his entourage resisted. Crowds gathered as he was paraded in one street after another, but nobody raised his voice. After several hours, one man rushed up to the guards and shouted, "He is innocent!" Then, in another quarter of the city, a second man went to the court and said, "Arrest me, I am guilty of blasphemy, and what was reported of the Sufi was said by me. He was only quoting my words in order to refute them." When the king and the Sufi met privately to discuss the day's events, the Sufi said, "You see, It is as I predicted. The man who said I was innocent was the half person who was not cowardly, and the one single man was he who was prepared to exchange his life for mine. Poisoning the untutored. A certain famous scholar was surprised and pleased when he started to receive, as pupils, batches of disciples from a Sufi whose liberal views were in total contrast to his own. For 20 years, nobody else could gain entry to the scholar's lectures, so filled were they with the Sufi's students. When he had come to the end of his teaching days, the scholar travelled to the Sufi's house. He said, "All these years I have been constantly delighted to note that you prize my teaching so highly that you have continuously sent parties of students to me. My lectures have been crowded out for 2 decades as a result." The Sufi said, "I am glad that you have been satisfied by my actions. For my own part, I am happy that you suspended your campaign against me as soon as my students started to go to you and did not restart it." The scholar, however, wanted to know more. "But do tell me," he said, "what made you act as you did? Which of my addresses impressed you most? How did you come to understand my importance and to respect my role?" The Sufi said, "Your role was fulfilled, and surely that should be enough for any man." "No," said the scholar, "it is not enough. Tell me, omitting no detail, what made you decide to send people to me?" "I ask you a second time, do not press me," said the Sufi. "I insist," said the scholar, "and I shall not cease to press until you have confided the pattern." "Well," said the Sufi, "something had to be done to prevent the untutored from being poisoned by your prejudices. I had only my pupils to provide. But we did not lose by it. They were able to complete their education by observing how not to think." The Promise. The Sufis say that most people for most of their lives are unable to learn deeper things. This is because of the way in which they interpret what others are trying to teach. 2 of the weaknesses which again and again manifest themselves are accepting words too literally and interpreting them too superficially. This story shows the 2 tendencies. The disciple represents the first, his friend the second. A dervish said to a disciple, "Promise me one thing, and I will do anything for you." The disciple agreed. "Now," said the dervish, "you shall promise never to ask me to do anything for you, then I'll do anything you need." One day a friend asked the disciple, "What are you learning from your dervish teacher?" The disciple told him, "He has instructed me never to ask anything from him." "That's not a teacher," said his friend. "That is a miser." Idolatry. Someone said to a Sufi, "Teach me to pray." The Sufi said, "Not only are you already praying, but a part of your mind is constantly engaged in it." The man answered, "I do not understand you, for I have been unable to pray to God for many months for some reason." The Sufi told him, "You said, 'Teach me to pray.' You did not mention God. Now, the prayer which you have been engaged in for all this time is prayer towards your neighbors, for you constantly think of what they may think of you. It is permanent prayer to an idol of money, because this is what you want. It is also a prayer towards an effigy of safety and another of plenty. When you have so many gods and so much prayer as a permanent part of your being, is it any wonder that you have no room for any other kind of prayer?" Understanding. A Sufi was asked, "Which was the most moving, the most instructive, or the most effective experience of your long life?" He said, "The one which I shall now relate taught me so much about what I already knew but did not understand, that it is, for me, the lesson of all lessons. Before it, I was one of the learned ignorant, thought a scholar and thinking myself wise. After it, I was the one who understood." It was when I went to see the great sage of Chihiltan. He was, when I arrived, due to the intrigues of narrow-minded men, surrounded by a howling mob whose minds had been poisoned against him. He stood on his balcony, not answering, but having come out because the crowd were baying like hounds. Then one man began to abuse him louder than all the rest, and he did so to such effect that the crowd were first silenced, listening to their jackal leader, then uncomfortable, aghast at such violence. Then, when the sage stood silent still, muttering against the man who had been their spokesman a few minutes before. I thought, surely this is a miracle, by which God makes his enemies the means of helping his friends. But what will happen to the leader, who is now becoming a scapegoat for the mob? Then, as the mass began to shout their own erstwhile leader down, I saw the sage of Chihiltan strike him a blow. I thought, he has done an evil thing, that he could not restrain himself at the moment of victory. But the crowd melted away, and I wandered off without visiting the sage, for I did not know how to think. After an hour or two I saw a poor dervish with a bowl of curds in front of him by the wayside, and sat down when he offered me some of his meal. He read my thoughts as I ate, for he said after a few minutes, "Faithless and merciless one, you wonder why the sage of Chihiltan could not keep his temper, and why he struck his tormentor, voiding in your eyes his repute for restraint. No, O ignorant measurer of superficialities, the reality is different from the imagination, because what looks to you like a fact is truly imagination. The sage hit the man, that is the only fact. His intention, on the contrary, is not a visible fact, but an imagination of your devil's mind. He hit the man to dispel the crowd, for if he had not, in another moment they would have attacked his tormentor. By hitting him, he satisfied the thirst of the mob for visible punishment. The attacker was not hurt, but rather protected from the fury of the mob, who would have torn him apart. So you see, what looked like an assault, and was in fact a blow, was the means of preserving the attacker. Until you can see these things, and see them in your heart, you will not be one of the elect, and you will play, like a child with nuts and raisins, and this you will call learning and assessment and knowledge. But you will not have understanding, and you will remain an animal forever unless you learn and learn and learn. But I immediately said, if this principle were to be adopted, then we would refrain from judging by appearances, and all manner of irresponsible things would be done in the name of saintliness, and every villain would thus have a license to do as he would, and the world would come to an end. The poor dervish looked at me, and he laughed, and then he cried, and then he said, O brother of bright countenance, have you not noticed that the world is coming to an end, and that the people who believe that they are doing good, and who lack perception and understanding, are the ones who are bringing it to its end? And yet you look not at that, but in fact wish to aid the process. Do not concern yourself with this, but rather develop the understanding of the meaning of events, not the speciality of the scrutiny of appearances. How the world aids the Sufi. One of the masters of the path was sitting in his assembly one day, when a student stepped forward and asked, "What analogy can there be of the position which the teacher occupies in this world? What, I mean, is his relationship with worldly events, and is he dependent upon them?" The teacher answered, "The world is there, and so is the teacher. He is within it and works outside it. It will reject him and also has to help him because of his unusual quality. This is recorded in the tale of the young man whose secret was not to be told. It is as follows. There was once a youth who wanted to serve humanity. Unlike most such people, he did not desire to do this for purposes of vanity, which meant that his service might be accepted, and that he might, indeed, achieve the role which is so badly needed by humankind. One night he had a dream, and in the dream he was warned that if he set off to try to help people, he would only harm them in the end, for they would oppose him and in so doing would increase their own cruelty. He was told in the dream that he should conceal from everyone until a certain time that he wanted to be useful. In the meantime, he was, however, allowed to say that he had a secret which was not to be told. The youth told his parents first about the secret. They eventually became so annoyed with him that they lost interest in him, and they made little resistance when he decided to leave the house to seek his fortune. He obtained employment with a stall-holder in the local town for a time, until one day his master heard him say that he had a secret which nobody was to know. "Tell me," he said, "or I shall beat you." The youth refused, and his master set about him with a stick until a passing merchant rescued him and took him into his employ. They travelled much, and eventually arrived at the capital city of the country. One day, the youth mentioned that he had a secret that nobody should know until a certain time. Again, the merchant tried to find out what it was, and when his employee would not tell him, he threw him into the street as a disloyal and probably deranged villain. At that exact moment, the Prime Minister of the country was passing. His king was dying, and, in accordance with the custom of that country, the minister had to go in disguise into the streets and seek a young man about whom some peculiarity had been divined by the wise men of the court. He would be the next king. As he stood beside the merchant's house, he saw the youth thrown into the street, and heard him say, "I will not tell my secret until due time." And this was exactly the phrase which the royal seers had instructed the Prime Minister to seek. He took the young man to the king's deathbed, and the king asked him whether he would accept the crown. "I will, your majesty," said the youth, "for the secret is this, that I will not be able to help humanity adequately until I become materially powerful as king of the country." The loaf of bread. A Sufi of great wisdom was asked for a parable of the work of the teachers and the nature of the disciples, and he at once answered, "There was in former times a man who wanted to protect a treasure from a robber, so that he could share it with the deserving of this world. The robber was strong and violent, and a generous man had nothing to help him but, of all things, a talking loaf. The robber arrived at the door of the house and threw it open. Just inside, on a small table, sat the talking loaf. The loaf said, "Honored friend, what is your mission? What your intention? What your purpose?" Now the robber, in spite of being uncouth and greedy, was, like most of us, also intensely curious by nature. He was, moreover, quite taken aback by the sight of a loaf which could talk. He said to it, How do you come to be able to talk? And what can you tell me?" The loaf replied, "I can talk because I am in this house, which is a magical one. If you come in, you too will develop magical powers." "That is exactly what I want," said the robber. "Before you enter," continued the loaf, "you should note that you will have to go through what I have gone through, which is no small matter." "And what have you gone through, you, a loaf, that I, an experienced robber, cannot?" "I do not say you cannot," said the loaf, "but I will allude to my experiences, so that you may have choice." "Tell me then," demanded the robber. "First of all," said the loaf, "I was a plant and grew in a field. Then a part of me became dry, like death, and fell off. It was buried in the cold ground, where it lay until it split open. Then it was soaked in water until it was swollen and shoots came out of it. It grew into another plant, and found itself seized and beaten until its husk was separated from its inward part. The inner kernel was beaten into powder, which was mixed with other powder and put away. Then it was taken out, pounded with water and other things until it became sticky, and placed in a terrible heat until it became brown, and lo, it was me." When the loaf looked up after this recital, it saw that the robber had fled, and he could be heard in the distance sobbing with fear. The Sufi continued, "The robber's greed to rob the house is the desire of the disciple before he knows that the treasure is there to be served, not to be stolen. The bread is the process of discovering this. But most disciples are not true seekers, for they flee from truth by imagining other things about the teaching." Intelligence and obedience. There was once a Sufi teacher who was approached by two men who begged him to allow them to become his disciples. He agreed, on the understanding that they were on 3 months' probation. For nearly 90 days the master gave them no tasks, told them no stories, invited them to no meetings. Then, when their time was nearly up, he called the two into the courtyard of his house and said, "I want each one of you to go outside, where there are camels. Each of you is to take the leading rein of one camel, and to bring it to me, climbing the wall and making the camel climb the wall." The first disciple said, "Master, it is written that man must exercise his intelligence. My intelligence tells me that what you ask is impossible, and my good sense tells me that you have only asked this in order to test whether I am intelligent or not, and whether I use my common sense or not." "Then," said the master, "you will not attempt to bring the camel over the wall?" "I shall not," said the disciple. "I ask forgiveness for appearing to disobey." Then the master turned to the second disciple and said, "What is your answer to my request?" Without a word, the second disciple started to go out of the courtyard through the gate. The master followed, motioning to the first disciple to accompany him. When they were all outside the high wall where the camels stood, the second disciple took the leading rein of one of the beasts and walked it to the outside wall. He then made an attempt to climb the wall, with the camel's rein still in his hand, making encouraging noises to it. When it was obvious that he could not succeed, the master said, "Return this camel to its place and follow me within." A few minutes later, when the 3 men were again standing within the courtyard, the master said, "Everyone knows, since the earliest days of humanity, that the path demands various capacities. These include the use of intelligence and the application of common sense, and also obedience. Obedience is as important as intelligence and common sense, Everyone who has ever taught will know that almost everyone will try to use intelligence and common sense in preference to obedience, thus putting these three qualities out of balance. The vast majority of humanity considers that to obey is less important than to think of a way out of a situation. But it is in fact known that none of these things is more important than another, except in the performance. Now we can find men of intelligence anywhere, but where can we find people of obedience? The first disciple is dismissed because he placed too much importance upon intellect. The second is retained because he did not jump to the obvious conclusion which men tell each other is the best thing to do, and yet which, as often as not, deprives them of full capacity. He turned to the second disciple and asked him why he had tried to do the impossible. The disciple said, "I knew that you knew it was impossible, so that there was no harm in obedience to see where it led. I knew that the easy way out was to say, 'It is impossible, I shall not attempt it because of common sense,' and that only a superficial person would think in that way. Everyone has as much common sense as would be needed to refuse to obey. Therefore I knew that you were testing my obedience and refusal to choose easy options." How to make them hear. A dervish, instructing a disciple, said, "There is only one way to make people hear you. You must know what you are saying, and you must have the necessary conduct for people to hear you." The disciple, irritated by the long time which his ancient mentor was taking to give out his wisdom, felt that he had heard enough, and went on his way. For some years he studied the art of knowing what he was saying, and cultivated the conduct of a good man. People began to respect him, and few left his presence without remarking what a pure soul he was. One day a young man arrived at the town where he was to make a speech. The youth kept shouting scandal, and everyone listened to him. Hardly anyone went to the lecture by the dervish's pupil. So he went back to his old master, now over 100 years old, and asked him to explain. "Ah," said the ancient, "you are the man who did not wait to hear the end of the teaching. You see, you have to be the kind of saint that people want at the time. If they want a real man, they will not go for teaching to a man simply because he looks like a saint. The qualifications for a teacher are not that he has a certain look, but that he has a certain effect." Hypocrisy. Yahya, son of Iskandar, relates, "I sat many evenings at the house of Sufi Anwar Ali Jan. People brought him gifts, which he had converted into food and caused to be served each evening before the time of meditation. He would not allow anyone to be near him, and sat in the corner with his hand moving from his bowl to his mouth. Many of those who visited him said, 'This man is haughty and lacks humility, for he draws himself away from his guests.' Each evening I moved my place imperceptibly closer to him, until I could see that, although he went through the motions of eating, there was no food in his bowl. At last I could not restrain my curiosity, and I said to him, 'What is the cause of your strange behavior? Why do you pretend to eat? And why do you allow people to claim that you are haughty, when you are in fact modest and abstemious, and do not want to upset or shame them, O most excellent of men?' He answered, 'It is better that they should think that I am lacking in modesty through observation of externals, than that they should think that I am virtuous through the mere observation of externals. There can be no greater sin than attributing merit through appearances. To do so insults the presence of the interior and true virtue by imagining that it does not exist to be perceived, Men of externals will judge by externals, but at least they are not polluting internal things. Whispering. There was once a Sufi teacher who was approached by one of his disciples. "Master," he said, "I am constantly bullied by the other members of the community. They make my life miserable. Unless it is your desire that I should endure this, I would like them to stop it." "Nothing easier," said the Sufi. "All you have to do is to come up to me when we are sitting in contemplation and whisper into my ear. Then I shall whisper into yours." No sooner had this happened the first time than the oppressed disciple became the most favoured among the community. After all, was he not allowed to speak to the master in whispers? One day, however, one of the more forward of the disciples said, "Master, may we not hear what you are saying to this fellow student of ours? After all, we are as docile and intent as he is." The master agreed, and the next time there was an assembly he called the formerly oppressed pupil and said to him aloud, "Can you yoke bulging eyes?" "Yes," said the man. "Good. What do you earn?" 10. "And what do you waste?" 5. "What happened to the 32? 29 are at home." The other disciples goggled at this, and when they were alone together they disputed loud and long about the inward meaning of the mystical conversation. Finally, however, their opinions were so diverse that they decided to ask the meaning. The favoured disciple said, "It is all quite simple. The master wanted to show you that you were easily impressed by trivialities, so he whispered to me. You yourselves decided that this was a mark of favour, and you made yourselves treat me well." "But what about the cryptic conversation?" "It had nothing to do with you. I earn 10 silver pieces. I waste 5 on my son's education." "But the 32 must surely be people of importance or spiritual merit." "The 32 are my teeth. I still have 29, so they may be said to be still at home in my mouth." "Ah," said the disciples, "he is trying to put us off, because the key is probably in the question which we have not asked. That will be the one with the real inner meaning." They asked the people, "What did the teacher mean when he asked if you could yoke bulging eyes?" "Give me a gold piece and I will tell you," he said. As soon as he had got the money, he answered, "That was a demonstration that you can yoke bulging eyes. The eyes are yours, bulging with greed. They are yoked by stimulating curiosity, because all trivial minds are manifested by inquisitiveness." "What then should we learn?" they cried in anguish. The teaching is, covetousness, whether in material or spiritual things, leads to pleasure in trivialities. This prevents you from gaining higher understanding and blocks your progress. It can only be dissolved by a demonstration of how trivial your thoughts really are. Self-obsessed. A man went to the dwelling place of a dervish and said to him, "I want to discuss my problem with you." "And I," said the dervish, "do not want to discuss it." The man was annoyed. "How can you decide that when you do not know my problem?" The dervish smiled. "Why should you bring a problem to me if I do not know about it and do not have perceptions greater than others?" Now the visitor was both confused and anxious. "Tell me what my problem is, then, and that will convince me," he said. "O human being," said the dervish, "you are almost completely awry. If I show you that I know what is in your mind, I shall divert your attention to the miraculous, and fail in my duty of service as against theatrical performance." "Well then," said the man, "give me the solution to the problem alone, thus fulfilling the requirement of service." "That I have already done," said the dervish. "But I cannot understand you at all," said the visitor. "I am not aware that you have given me any solution." "Then go on your way and seek the answer elsewhere." For months after that, this man travelled, and he talked to many people, describing his encounter with the dervish. One day it dawned on him that his problem had been self-centeredness, and that the dervish had been pointing this out. This was his real problem, not the one which he had imagined was his. Not long afterwards, in a city distant from the first encounter, he saw the dervish again. He said, "I have now realized the wisdom of your speech, and I seek to recompense you for your service to me." "You have already done so," said the dervish, "for in telling everyone of our conversation, you have been helping to teach, though not desirous of doing so, with yourself as the living illustration of ignorance and perplexity, like a man with an arrow stuck in his head, which all but he can see, and with a headache which he alone attributes to the difficulties attending deep thought. This was your service. But though in appearance and conviction you were trying to serve yourself, you were in reality serving wisdom, as I have indicated. In consequence, wisdom has partly manifested to enable you to see yourself a little better. You have, however, served not only wisdom, but also self-obsession, not yourself. In fact, anyone can make you serve anyone or anything by the simple method of convincing you that you are serving yourself if you take a course of action which is in fact designed to serve some other end. Who is the gainer from such a transaction? Alternative view. A certain Sufi agreed to take an ordinary man on a journey to see life and death from another point of view. They came to a tomb of a holy man, around which people were walking and saying prayers. The ordinary man said, "See how the memory of that man is blessed by these multitudes who circumambulate his resting place day and night." "The reality," said the Sufi, "is that the saint is revered because he spent all his time with people, so that they did nothing in this world, and he allowed them to crowd around him and ask him questions until he died of fatigue, cutting off his possible usefulness in other ways and places in the world." Next they came to the palace of a man who was waited on hand and foot by people who sang his praises night and day. "Let us shun this man," said the ordinary man, "for since he allows people to behave in this disgusting manner, there must be something unpleasant about him." "The reality," said the Sufi, "is that it is because the like of you shun him, he is at the mercy of fawning idiots. It would be far better to discover for yourself whether he really enjoys this adulation, and if he does not, to help him by showing those people that they are behaving in the wrong way." Then they came to a place where a man was talking to a crowd, and they were listening most attentively. "What a disciplined and worthy collection of people," said the ordinary man. "We should surely gain something by associating with them." "The reality is," said the Sufi, "that these people have formed such a habit of listening that they cannot think or act. It would be better if we were to help them think and act as well as listen, not just become listeners ourselves." The ordinary man said to the Sufi, "But if one cannot judge by the outward and by one's own inward feelings, what is one to do in the absence of a man of insight who will tell one what to do?" "I did not say that one cannot judge by the outward at all," said the Sufi. But I do say that to imagine that everything which looks the same is no basis for learning. The outward may be reliable, and it may not be. The teacher can help you to attain understanding which interprets the outward as well as perceiving the inward. While you seek information through outwardness alone, you will not be seeking understanding. If you want cherries, why do you look for diamonds? Disguise. A student travelled to a far country. One day he was invited to the house of a rich man, and he was amazed and disturbed to find, among the pampered guests, his own Sufi teacher, dressed like the leader of a cult. He said, as soon as he could speak to him privately, "Honoured sir, what has become of you? This matted hair, these bells and recitations, this grotesque robe. It is you who taught us to shun such things like the plague." "Hush," said the Sufi, "for it is not what has become of me, but what has befallen these people among whom I am working. Do you not see that if they thought I was not a fraud, they would never even admit me to their company? I realize that they would let me come here if they could laugh at me. Now it is for me to use this advantage to help them understand." Follower. A man went to a Sufi and said, "I wish to become your follower." The Sufi asked, "Would you become the follower of a dog?" "No," said the man. "Then you cannot follow our path, for I myself am the follower of a dog, and you should account my master as being greater than me." "How," asked the would-be follower, "can you be the follower of a dog?" "Because I once saw a dog deal kindly with another one which had surrendered to it." The visitor said, "But you have a regular system of discipleship, a study center, people coming and going and treating you with the greatest respect. You have reached a higher stage than looking at how dogs behave." "You are describing what you want," said the master. "You want to enter a teaching with regular rituals, with people showing respect, with a visible study center. You do not seek to be a Sufi. You seek to belong to such a community. They are not the same thing." "But if I have been attracted by your outward shape, it is your fault, surely, for allowing it to be presented to the world in this way," said the other man. "What the world makes of it is one thing, what the disciple understands by it is another," said the Sufi. "If you are seeking ritual, community, music, labor, service, as you understand these things, you will be most in need of those who can teach you through other methods. To pander to your outward requirements is not Sufism, though everyone in the world may think so." The ignorant. A certain Sufi was asked, "Why do you tolerate ill-advised questions?" He smiled and said, "In order to gain for us all the advantages of observing such queries as you have just made." Another who was present recited, "Without the night, who would know of the day? Bitter peaches are spurned, yet it is those which help in the acceptance of the sweet. The child endears himself to us by mistakes, and gives a clue to what we should do, just as much as we may admire a prodigy." 1001 Days. A would-be disciple visited the home of a Sufi teacher. He was told, "You must try to answer a question. If you succeed, he will accept you for teaching in 3 years' time." The question was put, and the seeker puzzled over it until he had the answer. The teacher's representative took his answer to the master and returned with the message, "Your answer is correct. You may now go away for the 1001 days waiting. after which you will be allowed to return here to receive the teaching." The applicant was delighted. When he had thanked the other man, he asked, "What would have happened if I had failed to provide the correct answer?" "Oh, in that case, you would have been admitted immediately." Classical encounter. The kind of classical encounters familiar to readers from the great Sufi literature of the past still continue all over the world. Their value both for the participants, for observers, and for those who read or hear about them also goes on in the same way. I was once talking to a noted theologian of Baghdad and touched on dervishes and their ways. Without troubling to inquire whether I wanted a harangue or not, he launched into a tremendous diatribe. They were frauds, impostors, and self-deluded. They wanted people to follow them and to get a fat living for posing and doing nothing else. Their mysteries and so-called psychological processes were nonsense and opposed to Islam in any case. The only good work connected with this repulsive cult was among those few clever and self-sacrificing Muslims who pretended to be Sufis and then steered people attracted to them back into the salvation of Islam. Not only were the Sufis horrors, but he would take me this very instant to somewhere where these foul heathens were even now assembled, and prove their noisomeness to me without any fear of contradiction, as a service to truth. I followed him through the streets to a house where, on his knock, the door opened and a young man led us into the courtyard beyond it, into the presence of a number of unhorrifying-looking people who were sitting, in the evening cool, around the rim of a quiet pool of water. They rose politely when the raging divine approached them, and motioned him to repose himself with murmurs of welcome. My companion was not very impressed. He started to shout, "Away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed," in a very loud voice, startling a collection of white pigeons who rose into the air and wheeled about. "Away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed." It started to sound like a litany as he repeated the formula again and again, now jumping up and thrusting his face first, then his extended forefinger into the faces of the dervishes. They said nothing at first. Then I became aware that they, too, were repeating the chant, "Away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed." This development so infuriated the alleged man of God that he gave a wild cry, smote the heel of his hand on his forehead, and, leaving me sitting there, rushed from the courtyard. I heard his shouting from the street beyond the garden wall, echoing away into the distance. The seated figures continued to repeat the words of their critic several more times until, becoming lower and lower, the sound died away. I asked their leader, seated on a sheepskin at the center of the group, why they should take up the cry of a detractor. He said, "The man who came here is a well-known and highly respected theologian and doctor of the law. Many of the things which he says, though only quotations and not reflecting his own state, are valuable and adequate admonitions. We are all aware that it is necessary to make away with hypocrisy, vanity, and greed, and we are of course grateful to those who remind us of it, so that we, too, may concentrate upon this necessity for a space of time. So we adopted this man's very good advice to dwell upon the theme which he brought us. No doubt it will do us good." "But," I said, "since he thinks that you are the hypocrites and miscreants who have to be opposed, and since he would not imagine that you are adopting the lesson, and since he must have regarded your echoing him as a taunt, what good has all this done him?" One of the other Sufis raised his head. "If he was trying to do good, he would not have sought any advantage from it. Real good is only that which is done without expectation of reward or fear of punishment if neglected. But if you have really not observed what advantage this theologian obtained, I will tell you. He gained the satisfaction of imaginedly convincing us that we were evil and insusceptible to truth. This, in his own mind, made him for the moment feel that he was in some way good. And since he is ordinarily in great doubt about this, he has to seek out evidence for it, and to provoke incidents which will support his flagging faith. The Doorways. Told by Nurjan Ali Bey. I was carrying a bundle of door frames down the steps of a college between the second and third floors. A well-dressed man sitting in one of the rooms opening off the stairway called out to me, and I went into the room to see what he wanted. "Get those things out of here at once," he said. I told him that that was exactly what I was doing. "But," I said, "I think they are of importance. See how well made they are, and how they fit one into the other for carrying, and how light they are. There must be a dozen here." I was admiring them because they had been made by the great teacher Mazumi. I knew his work, had found them in the college, realized that they were not allowed there, and was taking them to a safe place. I intended to inform him that I had them to save him from being criticized, because I knew that he was absent-minded. The other man said, "How can you talk with honeyed words about trivialities, negligible man?" I said, "These doorway frames were made by Ustad Mazumi." With hardly a pause, he answered, "Mazumi's work is both symbolic and functional. That he should leave so much of it here is a blessing upon us. I knew that he was here the other week, but I thought that he was visiting a colleague of ours. But to think that he was working, and those frames will certainly fit our doors. What wonderful fairy wood! You had better take them back to the floors above and leave them there. We can certainly make an exception in the case of Hadrat Mazumi." When I next saw Mazumi, I said, "Your immortality is guaranteed on earth. They value your doors above their souls." Mazumi said, "Nurjan, know that it was your late father, mercy upon him, who placed his cloak upon my shoulders, to make me accepted as his successor in the teaching. When he did so, he said, 'Give this robe to my son Nurjan when he is to succeed you. This day will be when people will think that your door frames are better than his company.'" I later discovered that the frames were not even ones made by Mazumi. But from that day, with Mazumi's recommendation, I became a respected teacher. Wishing to be wise. People often mistake dervishes who are treading the Sufi path for Sufis who have already trodden it. There is a tale told by a dervish which helps to fix this distinction in the mind. There was once a young man, he related, who sought out a dervish and asked him, "I wish to be wise. How can I achieve my wish?" The dervish heaved a great sigh and answered, "There was once a young man just like you. He wished to be wise, and this wish had great strength. Suddenly he found himself sitting, as I am, with a youth, like you, seated before him, asking, 'How can I be wise?'" Bound hand and foot. A disciple asked a Sufi master, "It is said that the world is deceit, and yet again that things of the world help to another world. How can deceit help towards goodness?" The Sufi drew a deep and cold breath and answered, "Harmless striped flies remind you of the sting of the wasp and help the fly. Is this deceit? When the predator sees the spots on the butterfly's wing, he imagines that it is the eyes of a tiger looking at him, and he flees. Is this deceit? Sometimes, indeed, there is no other way to treat with men than to appear to be something which will make them act in a certain way, for their own benefit. If I could only have an illustration of that, said the disciple. And so you shall, answered the Sufi. Have you not heard the true story of a great sage of former years? The King and the Doctor. He was a doctor, and the king of a certain country called him to treat his ailment. The sage refused. Then the king ordered soldiers to seize the doctor and to bring him to his presence. When they were face to face, the king said, I have brought you here, bound hand and foot, to treat me, for I am suffering from an unaccountable paralysis. If you cure me, I shall reward you. If you do not, I shall have you beheaded. The doctor said, Let us be placed together in a room from which all other persons have been excluded. When they were alone, the sage brought out a knife and said, Now I shall take revenge for the insult of your having treated me with such violence. And he advanced upon the king. Terrified out of his wits, the king leapt up and ran around the room, forgetting his paralysis in his anxiety to escape from the Sufi. As he cried for the guards, the Sufi ran to a window and fled. The king was cured by the only method which could have availed. But he nurtured a grievance against the Sufi for many years. Such is the peculiarity of men who think that deceit is always evil. Value of parables. Question. What is the value of parables in learning how to learn? Answer. This one should tell you, by means of itself, what use they are. My father's son. There was once a Sufi who was approached by a prospective disciple. The Sufi said to him, If I say, my father's son is not my brother, whom do I mean? The disciple could not work it out. The Sufi told him, I mean me, of course. Now you just go back to your village and forget about your desires to be a disciple. The man returned home, and the people asked him what he had learnt. He said, If I say my father's son is not my brother, whom do I mean? The other villagers chorused, You! You're wrong, he replied. My father's son is the Sufi in the next town. He told me so. Heeding and unheeding. Two disciples were once talking in a Sufi school. One said, I shall die if our master persists in ignoring me, as he has done for the past 10 years, for I came here to learn, and I feel that I am being prevented. The other was equally emphatic. I, on the other hand, he said, shall undoubtedly die unless the master continues to harangue me, for every time he does so I realize my ignorance more deeply, and am thus that much further towards wisdom. The remaining members of the community eagerly discussed which of them was right, until the master appeared for the weekly meal. Now one of the community seated himself between the two, and held up his hand to signify that he had a request to make. Continue, said the master. I wish to ask that you continue to ignore this man on my left until he dies, and begin to ignore this other one on my right for the same reason, so that the rest of us may become perceptive of your desires. In this way I hope that we shall learn, as well as being delivered from the tiresomeness of amateur dramatics. Disputation. It is related that two students of the Sufi way were arguing about man. The first said, Man arrives at truth by personal effort and research. Beginning with ignorance, he graduates to knowledge. The second said, A man arrives at truth only through guidance by expert masters. They almost came to blows, and were far from resolving their contentions when a real Sufi happened to pass. The two decided to refer the question to him. "Pronounce on this issue?" he asked. "Yes, please," they urged him. "Very well. Now, has each of you seen dogs disputing about a bone?" "We have," they said. "And have you ever seen the bone itself join in the argument? Think about it.